Where British inability to maintain their role as world policemen becomes crystal clear is also in 1947. In Greece, there is a civil war between Elan and Elas. One of them is communist, one of them is nationalists, and it's a guerrilla campaign all over Greece. The Soviets are backing the communists. The British are backing the nationalists. The British have been involved in Greek politics since the German invasion of Greece during World War II. The Britain says, we don't have the money for it anymore. Hot potato! At this point, President Truman steps up and does something amazing. President Truman announces to the country on television, a few Americans had television at this point, and it was also carried by newspapers, radio, and newsreels, what is called by historians the Truman Doctrine. We, the United States, President Truman says, will aid any country fighting for its life against communism. We will not allow communist infiltration to take over vast swaths of the planet. We are the friend of anyone who fights for their freedom against communism. As such, the United States will provide military aid to the free or nationalist forces inside of Greece, and we will stand with them to defeat the communist insurgents. And it works. At this point, the United States is overtly stepping into Britain's old shoes as the world's policeman. But unlike Britain, the American people are not necessarily reconciled to this. For centuries, the British Empire had been, from a British standpoint, a force for civilization and order in a crazy, chaotic, enslaving world. But the American people had started out in reaction against this. And there are deep and strong isolationist tendencies within American society and American politics. So when President Truman brings us out onto the world stage as the gendarme of freedom, as the world's policeman, many Americans are a little uneasy, but the Americans of the late 1940s had just experienced, they had living memory of World War I, of the Great Depression, and of World War II, and of the Soviet things that are beginning the Cold War. And they understood American isolationism right after World War I is one of the major causes of the Second World War. So despite the reflexive isolationism of so many Americans, the Truman Doctrine becomes law, policy, and it becomes the policy of the United States for the next 20 years, roughly from 47 to 67, deep in the midst of the Vietnam War. And it does save Greece from communism, and it is going to set the stage. Churchill's Fulton speech had awakened many Americans, and what the Soviets were doing in Eastern Europe, slaughtering free politicians, holding rigged fake elections, using their army to suppress any kind of free dissent. Anyone who is a prisoner of war captured by the Germans that was returned to the Soviet Union, Russian troops, was treated like a spy or a traitor, somebody who had given aid and comfort to the enemy. So if you were a poor sapped Russian soldier who was captured early in World War II by the Germans, and you survived their slave labor system, you'd be freed and returned to your own people, who would put you in the gulags for a long time for being an enemy spy, because you survived. You were allowed to live by the Germans, therefore you must have given them aid and comfort. The various things the communists were doing causes a number of huge changes in the United States. The Truman Doctrine is only one of them. I am so proud to be an American, and it's not merely my country, love it or leave it. It's the Marshall Plan. Anytime someone tries to tell you America's just a hegemonic power, we're just an empire like anyone else, we have a bunch of hypocritical idealism, but the truth is we're just as evil as anyone else, dude. Just say the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan. Here's the situation. Western Europe is starving. Starving people will embrace communism because at least they won't starve. Despite all the things communism will do to them, Starving people are desperate enough to actually calculate that accepting communism is a worthwhile thing to do. Even the British are having to ration bread. So, well, that was a big bump. With this reality, and with the communist parties in France, in Germany, in Italy, in the more radicalized people in Britain, there's a real possibility that communism will be voted into office in these Western countries, and that they will invite Russian support, and the Red Army will march to the Pyrenees and conquer Franco's Spain. And suddenly, Europe, the mainland of Europe, will once again be under a hostile empire, and probably the Americans would come in to save Britain, but it's a nightmare scenario. So how do you prevent this? Well, in typical American fashion, you prevent it by preventing starvation, by humanitarian action. Herbert Hoover would have been proud. In fact, he was. It's the same sort of thing he did after World War I, but on a much larger scale. The Marshall Plan is the only time in history when the victorious power, who was capable of taking over vast swaths of the world, does what we do. Let me explain. Every society that was industrialized had been bombed back to the Stone Age, except for the United States of America. The Russians had lost over 30 million people, plus the major industrial regions of Western Russia. The Russians were desperate and tired. The Europeans were desperate and tired. Japan was a charnel house. China was rife with civil war. India was poverty-stricken and overpopulated. The only place on earth that had a functioning industry was the United States, and we could have used that, certainly, to turn all of Western Europe into American colonies, to turn much of the Pacific into American colonies, and to challenge the Soviets in a genuine war of empire, like Risk. But instead, we take much of the extra money that we have. We take much of the inherent wealth that the United States has, combined with the relative strength the United States has as regards the rest of the world, and we dedicate it to rebuilding our allies in Europe and our enemies in Europe. The Marshall Plan floods Europe with American money to rebuild cities, sewer systems, electrical generator plants, electrical transmission lines, to rebuild schools and hospitals, to fill those schools and hospitals with books and medicine, to train doctors and teachers, to build new roads, to build new railroads. The very automobile plants in Germany that, along with Japan, helped drive American auto workers out of work in massive numbers in Detroit in the 1970s and 80s, were built with American Marshall Fund money at first. The United States, instead of conquering half the planet, which it could have easily done, rebuilt half the planet as free societies, fully empowered to thumb their nose at the United States, which they do again and again, especially the French. With the Marshall Plan, once and for all, the United States and the American people prove that we are not like everyone else. We are not just Latter-day Romans or Goths or Mongols or even French or British. We are Americans. We want free allies in a free world with free trade. We don't want to make China American. We kept China independent when the Europeans were about to carve it up. We don't want empire. We do want freedom. And those societies that embrace freedom, we will aid. And that has been the compact since 1947. The Marshall Plan, by allowing the people of Western Europe, including defeated Germany, to rebuild a decent middle-class lifestyle, staves off revolution, and prevents the collapse of Western Europe and a Soviet takeover thereof. Communism, like all forms of totalitarianism, thrive in times of economic collapse. Remember that. If we are facing really hard economic times, as we may be, watch out, because the party on the fringes, both communists on the left and fascists on the right, will try to use this crisis as an opportunity to take more power, to harm the Constitution, and eventually replace it with their new improved vision of utopia enforced by bayonets and bullets. Beware of people who are interested in destroying the economy and toppling the society for political gain. They do not wish you well. In any event, the Marshall Plan makes it possible for Western Europe to stand on its feet as a free society. Yes, beholden to the United States to some extent and dependent upon the United States to some extent, but with the freedom to not be slavish American colonies. And trust me, they don't act like that. Now, in Germany and Japan, you have a real problem, the same problem actually that we faced after the American Civil War. In the South, in Germany and Japan, you've got an ideology that most people believe in that's very, very, very powerful. And yet you want to build freedom in those places. How can you do that? How can you build freedom in an area where people are predisposed to think evil thoughts? We'll come to that next.